Okay, we'd like to turn to Luke chapter 12. Luke chapter 12, at the beginning of the previous chapter, chapter 11, Jesus is seen with his disciples and he's teaching them upon the subject of prayer. They had requested, Lord, teach us to pray. Time you get to the end of the chapter, in fact, most of the chapter, he's seen rebuking the Pharisees and the lawyers. The result of such is seen in verse 53 and verse 54. And as he said these things unto them, the scribes and the Pharisees began to urge him vehemently and to provoke him to speak of many things, laying wait for him and seeking to catch something out of his mouth that they might accuse him. While all of that was going on, the crowd that had gathered around Jesus was getting larger. We see in Luke 12, verse 1, in the meantime, when there were gathered together an innumerable multitude of people, insomuch that they trode one upon another. In verses 1 through 12, Jesus begins to say unto his disciples, first of all, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees, which is hypocrisy, which is what he addressed in chapter 11, was the hypocrisy of the Pharisees. So what we see here is he's speaking in the hearing of the multitude, but he is speaking specifically to, at this point, his disciples, or to his own. While Jesus was speaking, he's speaking wonderful spiritual truths. In verse 13, he was interrupted. So there's Jesus, he's speaking these wonderful spiritual truths. And one of the company said unto him, Master, speak to my brother, that he divide the inheritance with me. So this man, out of the blue, the Lord speaking wonderful spiritual truths, asked the Lord to intervene concerning his earthly inheritance. Again, Christ speaking wonderful spiritual truths, and this man, where's his mind? His mind is upon worldly matters, an earthly inheritance. He has no concern for his soul, has no concern for his spiritual well-being. He's more concerned about his physical well-being. He's focused and consumed with the material of present life. And it was this interruption that prompted Christ in verse 15 to give a warning. Take heed and beware of covetousness. It was this man's interruption that prompted Christ to say this. The reason to enforce that, verse 15, for a man's life consisteth not in the abundance of the things which he possesseth. To illustrate this, he speaks the parable of the rich fool in Luke chapter 12, verses 16 through 21, and that'll be our text. Luke 12, 16 through 21. So you see what's led up to this parable. And he spake a parable unto them, saying, The ground of a certain rich man brought forth plentifully. And he, this rich man, thought within himself, saying, What shall I do? Because I have no room where to bestow my fruits. And he said, this will I do. I will pull down my barns and build greater. And there will I bestow all my fruits and my goods. And I will say to my soul, Soul, thou hast much goods laid up for many years. Take thine ease, eat, drink, and be merry. But God said unto him, Thou fool, this night thy soul shall be required of thee. Then whose shall those things be which thou hast provided? So is he that layeth up treasure for himself, and is not rich toward God. What we have here again is what is known as the parable of the rich fool. In the parable, Jesus tells, we can probably safely assume, a farmer, a rich farmer, who is so focused upon the temporal. Remember the occasion of the parable, the man's interruption. So focused upon the temporal that he gave no thought to his soul. The man who interrupted Christ, back in verse 13, coincides with the man presented in the parable. The man who interrupted Christ, he did so while hearing Christ speak great truths and very pointed warnings. And he didn't get any of it. He didn't get any of it. This man is so consumed with that which is earthly that he didn't hear a word of Christ's message. The man who interrupted Christ, saying, Master, speak to my brother. Speak to my brother. I don't need to hear anything from you, but you need to speak to my brother. Speak to my brother that he divide the inheritance with me. What's this man's mind consumed with? Well, it's consumed with two things. One, his brother. The other, the inheritance. He's concerned that his brother is going to cheat him out of an inheritance. He was thoroughly distracted, sidetracked by the temporal, by what was going on. Thoroughly distracted. Christ is speaking. And this man's thoughts are upon the temporal. His mind was so consumed with what he thought to be a problem. My brother is going to cheat me out of my inheritance. He saw that as a problem. And he became so consumed with it that the truth is he was not interested in what Christ was saying. He was not interested in the message of Christ. May I say, he was so consumed with what he saw as a problem with the earthly that he could not possibly grasp what Jesus taught. I've witnessed individuals who've sat in church all their lives, and I don't believe they've ever heard a single word. Never have. Because they're consumed with life. They really have no interest in what the Lord has to say. So this man, like many a child of God today, he's consumed with and he's controlled by the temporal. This man heard the message of Christ, but everything that Christ said that day was overshadowed by, my brother is trying to cheat me out of the inheritance. Everything Christ said was overshadowed by this. He missed what Jesus said. It all went over his head. It meant nothing to him. The man who interrupted Christ was so consumed with and controlled by the thought that his brother was going to cheat him out of inheritance that he was thoroughly distracted and sidetracked from what Christ was teaching. He's not really even interested in what Christ was teaching. And he did not have the ability to grasp what Christ was teaching. He's so consumed, he's so controlled by the temporal that he's neglecting his soul. And what's truly sad is this man sees nothing wrong with what he's doing. He saw that as a legitimate question. He thought he had the right to interrupt Jesus Christ because his problem was bigger than what Christ was teaching. He's not really interested. And so it is today. Many of God's people, so consumed with and controlled by their problems, their afflictions, their difficulties, the circumstances of life, they cannot possibly grasp what the Lord says. They're owned by the secondary. Again, this man who interrupted Christ coincides with the man in the parable. In the parable, again, Jesus tells of a rich farmer, we're going to assume he was a farmer, who's so consumed with the temporal that he neglected his soul. And in addressing this man, verse 20, God said, "Thou fool, thou fool." Notice there in verse 20, "Thou fool," skip some words, "thy soul." Thou fool, thy soul. The man had neglected his soul for the here and now. Our subject is Christ's portrait of a fool. Christ's portrait of a fool. The lesson, there's many, but the lesson of the parable is that life is not about the temporal. It's not about the material. It's about the soul. There's much here by way of instruction. There's much here by way of warning to both the child of God and to the unsaved individual. We need to hear God say to this man in the parable, "Thou fool." And then he directed his attention to thy soul. Thou fool, thy soul. First thing we want to do, first point, is don't misunderstand what made this man a fool. Number one, he was not a fool because he was rich. That's not what made him a fool. It is stated in verse 16, "The ground of a certain rich man brought forth plentifully." That didn't make him a fool. The ground of a certain rich man brought forth plentifully. Nothing is said of oppression. Nothing is said of extortion. Nothing is said of fraud. Nothing is said of unfairness or dishonesty. Do not assume those things. A lot of people want to assume those things. They see somebody that has more than them, oh, they must have oppressed people. Don't assume that. There's nothing in the parable that even implies that he was not honest, industrious, enterprising individual. Do not assume that he wasn't. The man in the parable seems to be, there's nothing in the parable that would lead us to think otherwise, seems to be a man who made an honest living, had a legitimate profession. Don't assume otherwise. He appears to be a skilled farmer. Up in the morning while others were in bed. Active, diligent, persevering. These are not the things in this man's character that caused the Lord to say, "Thou fool." Jesus did not call this man a fool because he was rich. Nor will you find anywhere in the parable where Jesus condemned his riches. Nowhere. Riches does not make one a fool. Just because someone is rich doesn't mean they're a fool. Doesn't mean they're evil. The Lord, again, never once condemned this man's prosperity. Secondly, he was not a fool because he made plans concerning his wealth. We read in verse 16, "The ground of a certain rich man brought forth plentifully." So much so that we read in verse 17 that he said, "I have no room." So here's a man, his ground is brought forth plentifully. He's got enough sense to see, I have so much that I don't have barns big enough to hold everything I have here. I have no room. And he thought upon that. And I don't believe that's what made him a fool. Nothing wrong with seeing a problem and giving it some thought. And in verse 18, he came up with a plan. He said, "I'll tear down my barns and I'll build greater. I'll build larger barns. I have a storage problem here. Makes sense. I'll build something bigger." You either do one of two things. If you have a storage problem, get rid of what you have or make more room. And his decision, his plan was, I need to make more room. He came up with a plan. I don't think that's what made him a fool. So let's look at this man's foolishness. I believe the Lord calls him a fool because he was completely, just like, again, he coincides with the man who interrupted. He was a fool because he was completely self-absorbed. This man has a conversation with himself. The conversation is recorded in verse 17 through 19. In that conversation with himself, he uses the pronouns I and my 11 times. 11 times. He thought within himself. He talked the matter over with himself. And he even responded to himself. You read verse 17 through 19. Self is at the center. It's like the man in verse 13. Jesus speaking marvelous truths. And this man is controlled by the thought of his brother cheating him out of an inheritance. So here's this man, self is at the center. And God says, thou fool. Read verses 17 through 19. And you see the ruling spirit of this man's life was self. His focus was all wrong. And Jesus said, or God said, thou fool, thou fool. He was pursuing his own will, his own ends. And God said, thou fool. This man saw as the purpose of his life self. And God said, thou fool. If our life consists of self-will, self-indulgence, self-seeking, self-glorying, self-importance, we need to hear God say, thou fool. Thou fool. Don't become so wrapped up in self that you live the life of a fool. If your life consists of self-will, self-indulgence, self-seeking, self-glorying, self-importance, self-love, God says, thou fool. Paul said that man should not henceforth live unto themselves, but unto him which died for them and rose again. Oh, that we might not live for ourselves, but for him. To live for ourselves rather than for him is to live the life of a fool. Secondly, he was a fool because he did not acknowledge God. He refers to my fruits, my barns, my goods. Not one word about God. Listening to him, you would think that he was the absolute proprietor. He attributes all of this to his own efforts. And God says, thou fool. There appears to be no consideration of God. There is absolutely no acknowledgement of God. And God says, thou fool. Here's a man who lived as if there were no God. Psalm 14:1, the fool hath said in his heart, there is no God. The fool hath said in his heart, that's practical atheism. There is no God. Many a child of God lives their life that way. As if there were no God. Many people who say they believe God live their lives as if there were no God. And that's how this man was living. No acknowledgement of God whatsoever. Because he lived for self, without acknowledgement of God, his preparation and his motives were all wrong. He did not realize that all is vanity without God. I have all these fruits, all these barns, all these goods, but without God it's nothing. That's what the whole book of Ecclesiastes is about. And God says, thou fool. Listening to him, you would think that he was beholden to God for nothing. It was God that gave the seed and the soil life. It was God who sent the right amount of rain and the right amount of sunshine. But there is no thanksgiving. There is no praise given to God. no acknowledgement. God has been good to me. And God said, thou fool. We read in Proverbs 3 verse 6, in all thy ways acknowledge Him. We're to live our lives acknowledging God's presence, God's provision, God's goodness, God's long-suffering, God's mercy, God's grace, God's love. And to live life neglecting those things, not acknowledging those things, is to live the life of a fool. And many of God's people are guilty. Thirdly, he was a fool because he thought all of these riches were his. Notice, my fruits, my barns, and then again he says, my fruits, and then he says, my goods. He looks at everything as his own, with no thought of the one who gave it to him, with no thought of glorifying God, with the abundance, no accountability to God. Doesn't seem to be any thought. God gave me these fruits and these barns and these goods. How can I use them for the glory of God? That doesn't seem to be in his mindset. Notice 1 Corinthians chapter 4. Keep a mark there in Luke. But in 1 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 7. For who maketh thee to differ from another? I don't care what difference we're talking about. If it's health, if it's prosperity, whatever, doesn't matter. And what hast thou that thou didst not receive? Now if thou didst receive it, why dost thou glory as if thou hadst not received it? I believe that's what this man was guilty of. That's the life of a fool. Fourthly, we said that he wasn't a fool because he made plans. But he was a fool because he did not consult with God. He made plans for the future. That didn't make him a fool. But he did so without any thought of God. Without even considering the will of God for his life. And God said, thou fool. In all of his calculating, in all of his resolving, in all of his anticipating, there appears to be no thought of God. And God said, you're a fool, thou fool. There doesn't seem to be any dependence upon God, no recognition of God's authority as the rule of his life, no thought of obligation to God. I have all these fruits, all these barns, all these goods. Certainly I must be obligated to God. Doesn't seem to be in his thought process. And God says, thou fool. He was short-sighted. All he could see, just like the man in verse 13, all that mattered was the temporal. As children of God, we're to live our lives leaning upon God. We're to live our lives inquiring of God. We're to live our lives consulting with God, seeking God's way, surrendering to his will. Not to do so is to live the life of a fool. Fifthly, he was a fool because he looked to material things for happiness, for pleasure, for satisfaction, and security. Notice verse 19. And I will say to my soul, that is, after I build these larger barns to put in all my fruits and goods, I will say to my soul, soul, thou hast much goods, laid up for many years. Take thine ease, eat, drink, and be merry. His ease, the eating, the drinking, the being merry was all related to thou hast much goods. He saw happiness in these things. Saw pleasure. How many times people will say, well, if I had just a little bigger house or a little better car, or if I had this or I had that, I could be more happy. Thou fool. That's not what brings happiness. Material things had usurped the place of God in this man's life. And God says to him, thou fool. This man was depending upon uncertainty. He was looking at uncertainties and seeing them as certainties. The fruits, the barns, the goods, that's all uncertain. But he's looking at it as certain. I have years laid up for many years. These things are certain in his mind. He has more preference for time than he does eternity. He has more preference for the temporal than he does the spiritual. And God says, thou fool. He gives more preference to the world than to God. And God says, thou fool. The fruits, the barns, the goods have more preeminence than a soul. And God says, thou fool. This man looked at his fruits, he looked at his barns, he looked at his goods, and he felt secure. He felt invincible. And God said, thou fool. Thou fool. He looked to material things for happiness, for pleasure, for satisfaction, for security. The man in the parable has concluded that a man's happiness and rest is all about the things of this life. And that man can find rest in material wealth. Oh, if I had all the money they have, I wouldn't have a care in the world. You sit down and you talk to a rich person and be foolish enough to ask them, do you have any problems at all? Their lives are filled with problems. Possessions do not mean no problems. But this man has this mindset. I can be at ease. Life is good. And God said, thou fool. Thou fool. Don't be deceived about temporal things and live the life of a fool. Sixthly, this man was a fool because of misplaced value. The man was a fool concerning the value that he saw in the material and the fact that he did not value his soul. That made him a fool. Again, God says to him, thou fool. But then God reminded him, thy soul. Thy soul. This man placed more value upon fruits, barns, and goods than his own soul. People do it all the time. Oh, it may not be barns. It might not be fruits. It might not be goods. It can be anything. And they place more importance and they place more value in that than they do their own soul. And God says, thou fool. Thou fool. I don't believe God said that in anger. Thou fool. I believe He said it in pity. Thou fool. Thou fool. As a result of misplaced value, what follows is there's a misconception of what is important. If you place a wrong value upon something, you place a wrong importance upon it as well. He saw more importance in fruits and barns and goods than he did his own soul. Oh, how many are guilty. It's evidenced all the time. The way people live, the decisions they make, it's evidence where they place value. You see, this man was a fool because he did not realize that the best things in life are not things. Most people don't realize that. That makes them a fool. As a result of misplaced value and a misconception of importance, he's going to put more effort, he's going to put more energy and time to that which he sees as important. And in this case, he puts forth more effort, energy, and time to the temporary than he did his own soul. And God said, thou fool. Thou fool. He put more emphasis and more care upon the temporal than he did his soul. His priorities were all wrong. Anytime, I said anytime, look that up in the dictionary, anytime. Well, what, anytime? Well, what, anytime? Anytime you put temporal over spiritual, you're wrong. Anytime. It's never to take precedence. And when it does, we are living the life of a fool. Seventhly, and lastly, this man was a fool because he made no preparations for eternity. I am sure that it was very shocking news when the Lord said to him, this night thy soul shall be required of thee. That was not in his plans. His plans were, I'm going to build bigger barns and put all my fruits and all my goods in these barns, and I'm going to sit back, take my ease, because I have enough stored up for many years. What a shock. This night, thy soul, the thing that he had neglected, the thing that he paid no attention to, shall be required of thee. Because of the way that he lived his life, he was not ready to die. He had made no preparation. And let me tell you something. Buying life insurance is not preparing for eternity. He made no preparation for eternity. And God said, thou fool. Again, this man's life coincides with the man who interrupted Christ in verse 13. You know what? There's many sad things about the life of a fool. But one of the saddest things, and I've seen it over and over and over and over again, is the one who lives the life of a fool teaches their children to live that same life. And then those children teach their children. And on it goes. The life of a fool. The purpose of the parable is to show the danger and the folly of a misspent life. And any time, there it is again, any time the soul is relegated to the background, that's misspent. This parable warns against the tyranny of things. The tyranny of that which is temporal. Most read this parable and they see a rich man who owned a farm. And this man, this farm was very prosperous. And though all of that is true, that's not the problem. The problem is not that the man owned some barns. The problem is not that he had fruits and that he had goods. The problem was the farm owned him. That's the problem. That's the problem. God does not condemn possessions. He does condemn possessions possessing us. The parable is not about. You miss the whole point. Again, so many times in the parables, people miss the whole meaning of the parable because they do not go back to see what caused Christ to speak the parable in the first place. And in this case, it was the man in verse 13 who interrupted, putting emphasis upon temporal things rather than spiritual things. So the parable is not about material possessions, but about possessions possessing us to the neglect of the soul. To the neglect of the soul. In verse 22, following the parable, Christ makes application to his own. Well, he makes a general application. Verse 21. So is he that layeth up treasure for himself. Himself. And is not rich toward God. This man was not rich toward God. Those who are not rich toward God live the lives of a fool. Rich toward God. And he said unto his disciples, therefore, I say unto you. And then he begins, take no thought of your life. And he goes on, and you can read those verses. But he makes application to his own. In this parable, where the farmer went wrong, and where many are still going wrong, even amongst God's people, and that's who the Lord's speaking to here, they're going wrong in the same way. They get so consumed and so controlled by earthly matters that they neglect their soul. Very similar to the man that we looked at this morning. The world looks at God's way of life as foolish. Sadly, many of God's people look at God's way of life as foolish. The world thinks it's foolish to live your life for God, to keep the temporal secondary and never primary. The world thinks that's foolish. The world thinks it's foolish to always put God first. The world thinks it's foolish to seek God's will and depend upon God. But Paul said in 1 Corinthians 4 verse 10, we are fools for Christ's sake. Fools for Christ's sake. We need to ask ourselves, are you willing to be counted as a fool for Christ? It ought to be a compliment to you and I if the world thinks we're fools, because they don't think right. Are we willing to be a fool for Christ? We're not to be fools, but we ought to be willing to be thought of as a fool because we follow the Lord. Again, many valuable lessons, many warnings in this parable. The Lord paints us a portrait of a fool. Hopefully we do not identify with the portrait that the Lord paints. Brother Ben, you come and lead us verse song.